Hello, so this is sort of related to the camouflage videos but not entirely camouflage based, and this is if you're out somewhere, let's say in the woods or in open terrain somewhere, how do you keep yourself concealed? And this is more about theories to do with camouflage and avoiding detection rather than actually necessarily being like this is the best camouflage to wear and all things like that. So what I've got on at the moment is my old sort of Serbian Yugoslav jacket and a scrim net. The scrim net's not on over my face or anything, but as you should be able to see, there's that on, and I've got my flecked-on trousers on underneath that. So there you go, that's all that stuff. So what would you actually do then to make yourself less obvious? So one of the important things, and this is one of the ones I'll stress first because lots of people don't mention this, and I've seen lots of people do this wrong when they're actually trying to be avoid detected on whatever it is, whether it's real things or films and whatever else, is noise discipline. Don't go chatting around when you're actually, trying to avoid being seen. That should be obvious really, shouldn't it? But lots of people don't seem to understand this point, and that's, that if you're trying to hide in the woods or something, or you're trying to get from place A to B and not draw attention to yourself, don't go chatting loudly or doing other things that make noise. The reason being, obviously people can hear the noise sometimes before they see you, and then they'll know where to look. So that's obviously an important thing, noise discipline. Another thing related to noise discipline is if you're carrying stuff on you, make sure it's not going to make a noise. Half-filled canteens is a great example of this. The canteen constantly making a sloshing noise because water's moving around inside. Either keep it full or keep it empty, or keep it somewhere where it's not going to be jarred around much when you walk. So that's one of the things like that. Obviously not stepping on twigs and dry leaves, things that will make noise like that, but that's, I think, one of the more minor things because that makes a lot less noise. If you're walking around in the woods and you hear like twigs snapping in the distance, that can often be animals. If you hear somebody talking, it's obviously a person. Same logic goes, if you've got a phone, keep it on silent. Don't, even if, and ideally the mode that's total silence where it won't even vibrate, not where it's gonna, buzz and play a ringtone and things like that if you don't want to be heard. That's one of the major things because I often don't hear people mention that. So obviously it goes without saying with all these things, wear a camo appropriate for the environment or wear clothes that match the environment even if they're not camouflage. I did a video before where I was talking about, you can do a grey man type survival thing and keep actual, not camo clothes on, but still be hard to see. So what I mean by that is like either brown or sort of dark green trousers, sort of cargo pants, things like that, that would fit in properly. And things like green jackets or brown jackets, things in olive drab that aren't necessarily military. You can get lots of hunting and shooting jackets which are sort of brown and green colours that really don't stand out. I notice that a lot when I go for a walk, is if you see dog walkers, you can spot the ones really far away that are wearing like a bright white or a black t-shirt, and then the ones that take you a lot longer to see are ones that are wearing, like a hunting and shooting jacket, something like that, or other outdoor clothes that are sort of neutral in colour. You can even get like dark green rain jackets that would be fine. But the point is, obviously, if you're trying to avoid detection, make sure you're actually wearing stuff that will fit in. So it could be proper camouflage or it could be colours that are obviously good for the environment. Don't go around wearing like a neon shirt or a bright white or a pure black shirt, the reason being that your silhouette is going to become obvious very quickly because it's not a natural colour. Now, another thing is don't walk across the middle of fields, walk along the outside perimeter of fields. The reason being is somebody looks and glances into that field. If you're walking right down the middle of it, you're going to be really obvious. It doesn't matter how good your camouflage is when your silhouette is really obvious. If you're walking along the edge of a field, obviously there's a lot more sort of stuff near you that's going to help break up your form. Now, if you're aware that somebody might be looking for you, you might want to periodically sort of stop and kneel down. The reason being is obviously it's much easier to spot somebody moving than somebody still. So for that reason, obviously if you're crouched down somewhere every now and then to check that nobody's watching, you're going to be in a position where it's going to be much harder for other people to see you than somebody, just through the middle of a field. And obviously with movement, if you think somebody's looking for you, stay still till you know it's safe to move and then move slowly. Whatever you can do to not give your silhouette away is obvious, because the reason being, as I said before, is when you have a person, it's the human shape that is normally the first thing you'd notice along with movement. that's why disruptive camouflages are good, as I've spoken about before. I know this is a bit faded, but the splodges on camouflage are designed to make it harder to actually see your shape, because from a distance the colours will look like different blobs and the eye will have a much harder time working out that that's a human silhouette. The same thing goes with camouflage. It's actually better to have slightly large and baggy clothes on than it is to have very tight fitting camo things. There's a problem with lots of militaries now where they don't want to do proper dress uniforms, so they have like very nicely clean cut, sharp looking camo clothes, which are also field wear. The problem is, obviously, if you're in the field and your clothes fit you really tightly, they're both less comfortable to move around in because they're so tight, and secondly, the human silhouette becomes a lot more obvious. The really good things are like the baggy kind of raincoats and sort of ponchos you sometimes see people wearing, because when it's less of a human silhouette shape because it's so baggy, it's much harder to notice it's a person. So obviously that's another thing. Getting to the really kind of minute things now, because we've obviously covered sound and where you're walking and stuff like that. Another thing as well is bear in mind with lots of camouflages and clothes, if you're in the shadows in a dark area, it's much harder to spot somebody than if you're in a bright area. I've noticed this even when I'm walking down a path. You see a dog walker, even people, you know, not wearing clothes that are at all camouflaged. There'll be the sun shining and they'll keep walking under trees and out of trees as they're walking along. When they go under the trees and they're in the shade, it's much harder to see them even when you know where they are. So again, if they were wearing camouflage clothes and they were trying not to be seen, they'd become much more difficult to see. So obviously with something like a scrim net, as I said, there's lots of things you can do with something like this, including putting it over your head, tying it over your head. The reason being that with something like this, when it's over your head like that, when you're stood in the shadows, it's much harder to make out your face, especially with something like a scrim net, because often you can set them up in ways where, if you've got a big enough one, they could become quite bulky and, you know, obviously hide the human shape better. I was saying, if you can avoid looking like a human shape, that's better than looking like a human shape, obviously. So I think that's most of the points. You know, if you're trying to move undetected, be careful of what noise you're making. Make sure you're not always taking the most direct route, but staying by the sides of bushes and things like that. Both as well, because that will help block your silhouette. But if somebody did appear, you'd be able to very quickly sort of merge into the hedgerow. Even if you couldn't actually get fully in, you'd be able to kind of go back like that and, you know, flush. And then if somebody's looking, your human shape isn't going to be obviously visible if you're only partially sticking out. So lots of things like that. Again, with things like camo, it's at a distance. Unless the person has binoculars, they're going to have a very hard time seeing you, and they're going to have to survey the entire hedgerow if you were standing there, for example, rather than being able to instantly spot your silhouette. Because I've noticed, even when I'm walking around, if I don't have binoculars on me, sometimes you'll see something at a distance and you can't work out if it's a person or not, and it's only when you get closer you realise it's not. So, you know, there's times even then when it would be just something still that you can't work out is that a person or not. Sometimes you'll get that with random bushes and fence posts and things where they're, you know, vaguely human shaped, and it's at a distance and the right height to be a person. You're saying, is that a person when you're approaching it or not? So that would be kind of my advice. If you want to look into this in a lot more detail, there's lots of good military manuals that you can find either online or buy in book form that show you all about, you know, how to move to avoid detection and things like that. But the most important thing is noise discipline and knowing how to move, obviously. If you're not trying to avoid anybody and you're just out for a walk, that's absolutely fine, but it's an interesting thing to sort of pay attention to. But yeah, obviously, if you're not sure if you might be being watched, the most important thing is to stop completely still. Because even people sometimes standing out in the open, if they've got camouflage on, can be really hard to see. There's lots of pictures where people are testing certain camos and they have somebody standing out in the open, and even when you know where they are, if the camo's good enough and they're still, you know, as in, because obviously in a photo it would be still, it can be really hard to spot them. So obviously that's all the things to bear in mind for this, but I would highly recommend buying a scrim net. I've got another one coming when it eventually arrives. This is just sort of an olive drab scrim net. I've got one coming in Marpack camouflage. I think it's only printed on one side, but that's fine as long as you tie it properly. But as I said, with scrim nets you can tie them in interesting ways and everything else, and you know, hide the fact that there's a person under it. So yeah, there we go. So obviously I would recommend, if you're trying to avoid being seen, getting either camouflage clothing or clothing that's very bland looking and, you know, earth tones, either browns or greens, just simply because that's not going to stand out. Obviously don't go for bright green, go for a dark green or a brown, so you want to go for sort of colours like that or that really. If you're going for solid colours, get yourself some scrim net. This is absolutely great stuff, normally very cheap to buy, less than a £5 for a decent sized scrim net like this. You can also get ones with like fake leaves on it as well, which are quite good. You can get camouflaged ones, as I said, but you can get ones which are like slightly 3D effect, where the inside is, you know, the flat material, but then on the outside of the scrim net they've got like plastic fake leaves that look quite realistic, and the idea is that if you tied it around your head or whatever, the outside would have the little leaves and things sticking out, so at a distance it then becomes much harder to see a person's there. I'm sure even with this you can see obviously when the scrim net's over my head, especially if I flick the light off, if I was stood sort of in the back somewhere, the human form is much harder to see like that. So hopefully this video is useful for those people, but yeah, probably a lot to take in. I've repeated lots of points, but a good thing to bear in mind is not to do anything that makes yourself obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people don't follow disciplines like that. And as I said, it's one of those things that really annoys me in films as well, when you're meant to have some sort of elite military unit behind enemy lines, and what they do, they're chatting loudly, you know, whistling, stuff like that, and you think they'd never do that in reality. But yeah, just bear that in mind.